evening, everyone. Welcome to another Crosstalk. Thank you for joining us. Nathaniel, thank you for being here. We're going to continue in our Crosstalk to reflect on this story of Moses and what it is like to get to know God. It's actually a long process. It takes time. Our relationship with God is like our relationship with other persons. I mean, it's give, it's take, you learn, and you grow in that relationship. And as you said before, Moses gives us this long picture of 120 years of God experience. And it takes that long, really, for Moses, I guess, to really know God. So this has been an exciting series for me. I've just loved it, getting back into the Old Testament to see the consistent nature of God, to get a look at this life, and to bring it home into our own experience, because we have those periods of intense excitement when God seems so real and on the move, and then we move through that period into what seems like just a long, steady sort of life with God that may not be that exciting. So all of these things are mirrored in our own experience. So this has been a great series. I've loved it. Last week we missed our crosstalk. We were caught up in Bible school and lots of other things here at the church. So this is a little bit of a catch up on last week's episode, and then what we're going to be talking about this week. So can you kind of fill us in and help us wrap our minds around what this incredible story is telling us? There's so many facets of it.
Sure. So last week, just in brief, we talked about the daily life with God, that God has this vision that he shares with Moses and with the people while they're at Sinai, of what a sustainable long-term relationship with him will look like. And the two places that we went to look at that were the Ten Commandments and then the Day of Atonement. The Ten Commandments are found in Exodus chapter 20, and then they're also found again in Deuteronomy. And then Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, is found in Leviticus chapter 16. And the reason that we went to both of these is they seem to really sum up very well what God has in mind. One, that everyday life with God looks like a new way of living in relationship with God, yes, but also with all the people around us. So in the Ten Commandments, the first four are about our relationship with God, and then the second six are really about our relationship with other people. So that's part of what God has in mind. The other thing that God has in mind is that he wants to be completely present with us as we live out that daily life. And before Jesus, God has to figure out a way to be present with his people that's safe for them. One of the themes that we've dealt with throughout this story in Exodus is that God is just too much for human beings. And in order for them to come together, then there have to be precautions. And that's what all the stuff about clean and unclean is about in the law. And that's also why we have sacrifices and why we have special holidays. And all of that really comes together in the Day of Atonement, where God says, once a year, we're going to make a provision where we cover up all of your brokenness in life and blood. We'll cover you, we'll cover the priest, we'll cover my tent, we'll cover the Holy of Holies, we'll cover the altar that you use, and then it'll be safe. Your brokenness will be covered, and it'll be safe for us to live together for another year.
That's an incredible thought. And, I've been just reflecting on all of that teaching that we've been talking about prior to and on Sunday. This idea of being safe with God seems so foreign to the environment in which we live. We live in an environment which is everything from there is no God, this kind of staunch denial of spiritual reality. And then on the other hand, this kind of familiarity, this over-familiarity. Both are, in their own ways, are very, very dangerous. It's dangerous to be over-familiar, and it's dangerous to be in denial. And at some point, I want us to get into a group and just reflect on okay, what does it mean to be in relationship with a God who is holy, and that there are unsafe ways to try to be with God? I think that's still relevant today. And to just simply say, well, the cross covers it all, is to make a true statement, but it's so generalized that I think it's not always helpful just to say, well, the cross covers it all. Well, it does, but how does it?
Right. So that leads to wonderful explorations of what is Good Friday all about.
Yeah.
And it's a lot.
And
Good Friday is about a lot of stuff.
And what is everyday experience of God like? It's not just one day that took care of it all. I think it's one day that set the standard to give us the resources to carry into the future. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. These are just incredible studies. And thank you so much for unlocking all of these really good questions that we can pursue. So, that's one thing. We're going to learn to live with God on an ongoing basis, both as individuals and as community. This is community life. We're going to learn boundaries, which are something that our culture is not very good about observing in any way. But now we're turning to something else when we relate with God. What else is going to happen?
Right.
Is it always going to be great? Sun's going to shine?
So, again, the big theme that we've been dealing with is Moses' experience. And we should be able to find our experience in Moses' experience. And we started off with a person who didn't know God and then meets God in this fantastic way, and then gets convinced that you settle into this long-term pattern with God that's good. It's boring, but it's good. And so Moses is really getting sold on this. Moses is spending a lot of time with God. Moses agrees with God's vision. Moses begins to long after God's vision, that these people could actually amount to something, that they could be what God intends them to be. Again, I think one of the things that held Moses and God together in the beginning is this shared concern for the people, for this family. I think it's one of the things that early on convinces Moses that God is good and that God is worth interacting with, this common concern for the people. But we also find that God's vision is a lot bigger than Moses. Moses just wants them to stop getting picked on in Egypt. But God has this bigger vision that they're going to become this nation, holy nation, this kingdom of priests. And Moses buys into that. So Moses is, throughout the story, Moses completely buys in. And in 2 weeks, we'll talk about Moses' goodbye sermon as a very old man in the book of Deuteronomy. And what is this long life with God meant to Moses? But this week, we're turning to Numbers. And Numbers is a really hard book. Not because it's boring, because it's sad. Leviticus is boring, and that's where we were last week. And,
boring is tedious anyway.
Tedious, yeah.
Maybe that's a better word.
It's tedious, it's repetitive.
Right.
We got a flavor for that last week when we read a whole chapter out of Leviticus. Important, but
not scintillating.
Mundane.
Yes, it is.
Boring everyday life. When we get to Numbers, we return back to story format. It's not laws given anymore. We're back to a story. And it's the story about kind of what happens after the people leave Sinai. And at the beginning of the story, God says it's time to go to the land. I've introduced myself to you. We've made covenant together. You understand this kind of daily life that I want you to live. Now it's time for us to go to your home. And so they make the move from Sinai up towards Canaan. So along the way, God is leading. Moses is the face that people see. God is still present in the pillar of fire, but Moses is the person that everyone interacts with. And as the people move towards Canaan, instead of growing into deeper trust and deeper excitement, they grow into deeper distrust and deeper dissatisfaction. And Moses is caught in this hard place where Moses has picked his side. Moses is siding with God and everything that God stands for, and the people rebel continuously against Moses. And by extension are rebelling continuously against God. And we find out that while there are blessings associated with getting to know God, it also puts us in a hard place because it's going to put us on the wrong side of people sometimes. So, briefly, do you want to talk about some of the rebellions that get led against Moses?
Well, I think his brother and sister get upset with him on his choice of wives. These are, we're back in the day of several wives and polygamy, but so they get upset with Noah.
Yeah, so
Moses.
his own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, start grumbling against him. They say, as Moses the only person that God has spoken to, we should be in charge. And they lead a rebellion against Moses that God has to deal with.
This is his brother and sister.
Brother and sister.
Come on now.
There's also a rebellion by a group of people. The family of Korah decides that they don't like the way that Moses and Aaron are running the joint, and they decide that they need to take over control of the tabernacle. So the family of Korah leads a rebellion, and again, God has to deal with them. And then for me, kind of the greatest summary story about the people's rebellion is the very hard story about the spies who were sent to go check out the land of Canaan.
Yeah.
So after this long time in the desert where people have been grumbling against Moses, we got to get this guy out of here. Things really come to a head as they have come up out of the Arabian desert, and they're in, I guess, Jordan, thinking about crossing the Jordan River and coming into the land of Canaan. And we all know how the story goes, but we kind of sum it up for us.
Well, they sent spies in, 12 spies, I guess, representing each of the tribes of Israel. And short story is they come back and say, yes, this is an incredible land. It's everything God said it would be. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, huge produce, everything's great, except there are also huge people occupying the land. 10 of these spies say, we haven't got a chance. We're not going. And only 2 are willing to trust God and say, no, we can do this. And so that is a bad situation.
It is a bad situation, and it's actually even a little bit more dangerous than that. The people come back and they have this report. We can't attack these people, though. They're stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said it devours the people who are living in it. And all the people who we saw there were huge. We looked like grasshoppers next to them. So there's the complaint. But then the complaint goes further. That night, all the people of the community raised their voices and wept out loud. They said, if only we had died in Egypt. And then they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt.
Wow.
And they make a plan. The whole assembly talked about stoning Aaron and Moses and heading back to Egypt. And then God has to get with them. But that's just this incredible, I don't even know what you call it. Distrust is not really the right word. Hard heart is not really the right word. It's this sort of angry rejection of everything that God has done, shown, promised. And it's a rejection of everything that Moses has tried to share with the people.
Yeah. And so now Moses is in danger. And the phrase that caught my attention is we need to choose leaders and get ourselves back into slavery. We need to get back to Egypt. That's quite remarkable.
It really is. So, again, we could talk all night and day about human nature and how it's so broken. But, again, our story is more about Moses and Moses' experience. So, again, for Moses, this is this rejection, which has to be painful. We read a similar story with Samuel a little bit later on. But it's interesting, Moses' reaction, the first thing that he does is he finds himself again pleading for the people. God says, I'm going to kill them all because they've asked for it. And Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people, which is extraordinary, given that they're calling for his head. He still finds it in himself to plead for them. And he's still willing to not only work with them, but work for them. And that's extraordinary, I think.
It is. It really is. And all of this while, I guess, Moses' relationship with God is deepening, while the people seem to be moving as fast as they can away from God. But Moses is learning that place of God's passion. He's learning the place of God's plans, beginning to think the thoughts of God. And once again, I'm just struck by this idea of a shared life we've been talking about in New Testament terms, but we find here an Old Testament example of this kind of shared concern, shared life between God and Moses that's even, would you say, maybe even deepened by this crisis?
Yeah, well, I think, again, we see that Moses' initial interest in the well-being of the people has been sustained the whole time, but his hope for them or his understanding of what they can be, I think, is changing. And he's beginning to see the people not just with his own eyes, but he's beginning to see them with God's eyes. And, we live in the age of suspicion, particularly around power. And I guess there's some people who would say, well, Moses is just trying to maintain control. He's built a good thing for himself. He's the leader. All of this is going to look bad on him if things fall apart. He's trying to save face. He's trying to maintain control. He's trying to, stay at the helm of this ship that he has kicked off. That's not really the Moses that we meet in the story.
Not at all. Not at all. That sounds more like the propaganda that's coming from the people in Moses' day. That's, this is your deal, Moses. This is your ego, Moses, so on and so forth.
Right. And it's not at all. Instead, we find this person, Moses, has completely bought into what God is selling. And this vision that God will actually bring the people into the land that he promised. And that they can actually live this new way that is revolutionary.
This new way that's envisioned in commandment, envisioned in tabernacle worship and all of this new way of life.
Yeah, that you can find a new way to relate with your neighbors, and that you can do it while God is living with you. So it's interesting when we get to particularly Deuteronomy, but even back in Exodus and Leviticus, there's this constant reminder: when you come into the land, don't ever forget that you are a slave. When you come into the land, don't ever forget that you are a foreigner. Because that changes the way that you treat other people. And we find that on God's lips, and we find that on the lips of Moses consistently. Don't ever forget where you came from. Don't ever think you're better than anybody else, because you're not. So again, we really do find this expectation that they will live a way different, and they'll prosper a way that is different than the people of Egypt had, than the people who had inhabited Canaan before them, and then the other people in the ancient Near East. There are many, some of whom were very successful and very wealthy. But God and Moses seem to see this third way, that's based on empathy.
Yeah, and based on God's presence, based on empathy. I just love the way you summed the law up in social math. It is an empathy with God, as well as an empathy for other people, and this wonderful kind of life. But we read the story of this rebellion focused against Moses, coming from the people. But there are dire consequences for this. And do you want to get into that a little bit? I know you'll go Sunday there, but what happens to the people?
Sure. And so this is the hard part where we have the lost generation. It should not have taken very long. It shouldn't have even taken a year for the people to go from Egypt to the Promised Land. That was God's intention. But they are their own worst enemies. And as a result of this rebellion in particular, God makes a promise: no one who saw what I did for them in Egypt, not one of that generation will enter the promised land.
Two exceptions?
Except for Caleb and Joshua.
Yeah, two exceptions.
Right, and Joshua will be the one who succeeds Moses and leads the people into the land. But with the exception of the two, God says, not one of them who experienced my power, not one of them will enter the land. And so we're given the 40 years of wandering in the desert. And it's just such an unnecessary waste.
Yeah, incredible consequences from just this lack of trust, this desire to take control.
Well, and this sense of entitlement, I have an idea of how it's supposed to go, and it needs to happen that way now or else. And that sense of entitlement it does not work in life, and it does not work with the Holy God.
Yeah, one of the things I have just been reflecting on, you have this rebellion, this sense of entitlement, this sense of I want it my way. And when you look at what God had done for them and what God had promised them, God had been faithful in the past. The future was filled with promise. Joshua and Caleb got a vision of that and said, this is really good. This can happen. But the others didn't, and it's so irrational to me that, God does all of these things, gives us all of these signs, and we're going to go there in a couple of weeks. People choose death. And it's remarkable to me because in our culture today, I see people just choosing death. It's obvious what they're doing is a dead end. It's painful. It's going to hurt them, people and others around them. And yet people are still pursuing these dead ends.
You can put it in front of them. You can walk through all of the probable consequences, and they'll still say, all right, I want to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to follow this way of death. And I guess it opens for me this whole backdrop, and it's interesting that this is not a part of the story, but this spiritual darkness. I think we catch glimpses of that perhaps in Egypt, of the other gods. But by this point, it's just human rebellion and self-imposed darkness, and this self-life can become very, very evil and destructive. It's we have this example, and I guess, it wasn't lost on the Apostle Paul and so many others who kept in the New Testament, and the psalmists going, remember and don't do what they did at Meribah and Massah. Don't exhibit the lack of faith and escape from the Sabbath rest. You get that in the book of Hebrews. And even that sort of is the recounting of, God says, you'll never enter the land. And the writer of Hebrews brings that back to us of this real challenge of faith.
Yeah. So it's a incredible story. It's a wonderful story. Numbers is a particularly challenging one for me. And I think one of the big themes that develops with people who brush up against the story is that God is not fair, that God is harsh, that the people maybe are getting harder treatment than they deserve. I don't think that's true at all. No. I think the people are getting exactly what they asked for. And it's not because God's a bully. It's because they are so unwilling, again, just to receive the invitation to take hold of life. And God's not being a bully. We get at the end of the book of Numbers, we'll see exactly how God feels about the people. Left on their own, they would quickly destroy themselves. But at the end of all of it, God finds himself putting words in the mouth of a foreign prophet who's been sent to curse them. But God is still looking out for them, still taking care of them. And it's not anything that has to do with their merit or their ability or their brains or anything. It's just pure grace that they're not rubbed out.
Yeah, and once again, I'm so appreciative of this series, and we find ourselves back in narrative, and I'm reminded of the challenge of narrative to the listener or to the reader of finding ourselves in the story, I think it's easy to go, oh, I'm Moses and I'm living in this generation where it's tough to be a representative of God, and we find ourselves in conflict. That's one part of the story. It's also possible to be part of the story of, the people, and maybe it's a little bit more difficult to see ourselves in rebellion, but that's part of the story. And then there's God's perspective of dealing with these people and how judgment is visited. From God's perspective, you see all these people rebelling, and sometimes I tend to think, well, God must throw thunderbolts down of judgment or something like that. And we do find some snakes and that sort of thing in the story, but more often or not, I think God just turns them over to their own desire. And that's what Paul says in the book of Romans, that the worst judgment is when God says, okay, if this is what you want, if you don't want to go in the land, okay, wander in the desert and reap the benefits of your really, really, really poor choices. So I think, there's that challenge of narrative. Where am I at this moment? Am I Moses, a part of the people, or sensing, God is just turning people over? I mean, it's a real challenge, I think, and a real opportunity to learn.
And it is challenging, and I guess what we'll get into Sunday is really in particular Moses' response, and what does his relationship with God, where does it take him? Mm-hmm. And yes, Moses is at odds with the people, but again, we don't find him very angry. And maybe that's the hardest challenge for us today as a church, because it's no secret that the war is on against Christ and against Christ's church and against people of goodwill. We're all sitting ducks. Yeah. But the answer is not anger. Mm. At least that's not God's way. That's not Moses' way. It's a pretty extraordinary story, pretty challenging story.
Absolutely. Looking forward to Sunday and hearing this, and I hope you are too. Please continue to read through those great books of Exodus, Leviticus. Hang with it. It's worth it. And then Numbers, and then we'll end up in Deuteronomy. Read with us those stories. Join us if you can on Sunday morning. If not, we're on streaming, so catch us on the stream. And we look forward to being with you again as we encounter these incredible biblical truths and enter into the biblical world, begin to develop a biblical and spiritually healthy worldview.
Well, yeah, and these stories are so important. We've talked about it several years ago. Orlando, the city of Orlando, had a big ad campaign. And their ad campaign was, "We tell the stories of your life." Ooh. And that's dangerous for a variety of reasons.
Yes.
This needs to be the story of our life.
Yeah.
It is worthy on many different levels. If we just look at it as a work of literature, it's worthy. But how much more that we meet God, we meet God's heart, and we meet clear instruction. These need to be the stories that define our lives.
Stories of life. And, we talk about sprinkling the blood as the symbol of life, and the life is in the blood, and so the high priest was Aaron was sprinkling blood, sprinkling life. And, that image is sort of, okay, so what I do with that? But I think when we tell these stories, what we're doing is sprinkling life.
Oh, yeah.
In the midst, and as you said,
we're redeeming, covering. Yeah.
And so these stories are the modern, to me, one of the modern equivalents of the sprinkling of the blood is just telling the right story to shine light into the darkness.
Absolutely, and there's more than enough of it.
Yeah. Great. Nathaniel, thank you so much for getting us steered in this direction and unpacking all of these great truths for us. You want to pray us out?
Sure.
Okay.
Lord, again, we give you thanks for these stories, the account of your dealings with your people. And we give you thanks for Moses and people like him who have sought after you and who have found you and who have been so impressed, so taken away that they've given themselves to wanting to be like you, to being this link between you and everybody else. We pray that you would continue to be present here at Trinity and that you would make us into one of those links. A people who know you well and who are just totally taken away with your vision and your hopes for this creation. And that it would be a blessing to the world around us because it is falling apart. We ask that you would preserve us, that you would bless us. Keep us safe till we meet again. Amen.
Amen. Good night. Lord bless you.